I will hand over. We're welcoming Amber and Eileen Robinson as well today. All four speakers will present just a moment. So if I hand over now to Lida and to Carolyn.
Great. So I think what we're going to do is I will, Carolyn and I have divided it a bit. So I will start off and say a few words about kind of the overall volume as well as part one, and then Carolyn will do parts 2 and 3. As far as introductions, I'm happy to introduce myself. Maybe, Carolyn, would you be okay to introduce our 2 speakers at the end of your bit? Carolyn, do you want me to introduce you as well, or?
Sure.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to celebrate the launch of Color Protocols, which came out on September 30th, so I guess exactly a month ago. And I want especially to thank Sarah, Liz, Vicky, and the BAFTA Color SIG, as well as the Color Group Great Britain for the invite. I've been following the Color SIG as well as its members' scholarship for some time, and I'm really thrilled to be getting to know this community better. We don't have anything equivalent to this in the US when it comes to kind of film and media studies and the visual and material culture of and color. So I guess I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Lida Zeitlin-Wu. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm currently completing a manuscript called How Color Became a Technology, the Making of Chromatic Capitalism. And then my co-editor, Carolyn Kane, is professor, sorry, let me find the exact wording, is professor of visual communication at Toronto Metropolitan University, and she's the author of many books, including Chromatic Algorithms, Synthetic Color, Computer Art, and Aesthetics After Code, High-Tech Trash, Glitch Noise, and Aesthetic Failure, and most recently, Electrographic Architecture, New York Color, Las Vegas Light, and America's White Imaginary. And so, as I mentioned, I'm just going to try to keep my remarks brief to make space for our contributors' presentations and a robust discussion. So I will just say a few words about the overall book and part 1, then Carolyn will take over and talk a bit more about parts 2 and 3, and then we'll be joined by 2 of our wonderful contributors, Eileen and Amber, who will present on their 2 very different yet complementary pieces in the volume. So this book was a labor of many years. We started working on it before the pandemic. And if you do get your hands on it, you'll notice that it's in full color, which is not something that you can really safely assume with academic print publishing. So that was something we were really happy about, is just the quality of the color images in the book itself. Carolyn and I had collaborated for some time in kind of conference panels. We knew we wanted to work on a book-length project. We started talking about kind of what we might want to do. And we realized that we shared a common frustration, which I'm sure those of you here today who also write about color will relate to, which is that whenever we told people, whether in academia or otherwise, that our work focused on color, we would get the following response. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we would get this question, right? Color as in color or color as in race? I'll be curious to hear later on if other people have gotten some version of this question, but it really exposes 2 fundamentally distinct understandings of the word color, right? And in one of these understandings, you have this kind of so-called abstract color, which describes a sensory phenomenon, color as a measurable set of wavelengths in the visible light spectrum, quality of light or pigment. And then in the second instance, color denotes skin pigmentation as a culturally encoded marker of race, even though, of course, these kinds of stereotypical descriptors, black, white, yellow, red, etc., don't literally describe the color of anyone's skin. So we soon realized that there were 2 parallel conversations happening that rarely intersected. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So one of these conversations, as you kind of see on the left, situated primarily in kind of the history and theory of art, architecture, design, and sort of visual media broadly defined. So you might see this in the so-called color theory classes that are taught in a lot of art and design programs, which are predominantly formalist, rooted in kind of Western aesthetic paradigms from the Renaissance through the Bauhaus. And then the other conversation parallel is more in the history and critical theory of race, ethnicity, indigeneity, and coloniality. So these are fields which frequently deconstruct terms like color blindness, colorism, but mostly in a kind of legal and political rather than an aesthetic context. And you'll find that if you just do a quick library search for color, then you'll get numerous titles that seem to be about color in the first sense, like this book that has Technicolor in the title, but really are using that more metaphorically. Next slide, please. And we also noted that there was no existing anthology that brought together these conversations. And simultaneously, we were also starting to see some exciting scholarship that explicitly addressed what we kind of refer to throughout the volume as color's double valence as both race and hue. So I should say Michael Rossi, whose book Republic of Color is second from the left, and then Nicholas Gaskell's Chromographia. Both these scholars contributed original essays to the volume as well. And then we also see color's racialized double valence in objects like Shirley cards, sometimes known as China girls, test cards of almost entirely white women, which were historically used to calibrate photographic and screen media to more accurately represent what were called normal flesh tones. And you see this kind of image on the cover of Genevieve Yu's book on the right. And you might notice also that the cover of Color Protocols is a sort of glitched version of a Shirley card. So it's no coincidence that the Shirley card is a recurring cultural and media artifact throughout the volume, because it reveals the ways in which color's technical and sensory properties are intimately related to race, and how race is in turn deeply linked to protocols of color indexing and ordering in chromatic media. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by protocols? We're referring broadly to a set of normative functions which govern how specific technologies operate, as well as a series of culturally encoded habits and practices. So when it comes to color, we might think about standards like the Pantone matching system or hex codes for web-safe color, which ask users to implement color in these kinds of predetermined, often semi-automated ways. And so by using protocols as the overarching framework for the volume, we're hoping to encapsulate the ways in which distinct media forms and technologies, from written text to screen-based optical media and visual art to digital and algorithmic media, rely on forms of racialized color encoding that are particular to their cultural and historical context. So as the essays demonstrate, most color protocols result in a process of obfuscation where embodied experiences and complex cultural narratives are boiled down into a singular, seemingly apolitical choice that is almost always coded by default whiteness. So if we go to the next slide, a kind of quintessential example would be something like the infamous Flesh Crayola crayon, right? Just one choice that sort of builds in assumptions about color as race. Can we go to the next slide? So just a quick note about the essays and how the book is structured. So as I already mentioned, Color Protocols is the first systematic introduction to color's racialized double valence within a media studies context. So in that regard, given that this event is being held through the Color and Film SIG, I think it's also important to make it clear that this is not a film book per se. Rather, film alongside other screen media like photography and television, as well as non-screen media. It's one of several different media discussed in this book. And although Carolyn and I are both trained in this area, my PhD is in film and media and hers is in media, culture, and communication, we really wanted to do justice to color's capaciousness and create an interdisciplinary dialogue across the arts, humanities, and qualitative social sciences. So some of the fields represented in this book beyond film and media studies include literary studies, cultural anthropology, the history of science, American studies, East Asian studies, theater and performance studies, and more. And I hope that when you see the presentations from two of our contributors, you'll sort of get a sense of the disciplinary range. As for how the book is structured, we divided it into three roughly chronological parts: grammars, images, and algorithms, each of which is preceded by an introductory essay written by Carolyn and myself. Carolyn will talk in more detail about parts 2 and 3, but just in brief, part 1 focuses on primarily verbal, linguistic, and text-based media at the turn of the 20th century. Part 2 addresses the ways in which the racial grammars, as we call them, of part 1 became absorbed into the visual technologies of theater lighting, celluloid film, and analog photography. And then finally, part 2 addresses how algorithmic tools like search engines, digital filters, and facial recognition technologies encode chromatic racial bias. And we have contributors from both parts 2 and 3 here today. Also important is that each section actually contains both original essays and republished excerpts. So in this sense, we're hoping that this book will be a kind of hybrid reader and anthology, ideal for both educators and students, one which sheds light on older writings through sometimes surprising transhistorical juxtapositions. Could we go to the next slide? We'll just get a kind of closer look at part 1. So part 1 especially is unique in that it contains writing by both living and deceased authors. So we did not have Frederick Douglass write us an essay for this volume, but we do have Frederick Douglass and Du Bois reflecting on racism in the Reconstruction era United States as they experienced it in real time. And then Nicholas Gaskill, Michael Kivak, Anne Enling Chung, and Michael Rossi reflecting on the legacy of color-coded racism at the turn of the century and its implications for the present day. So at first glance, Douglass is the color line or Du Bois is the souls of Black folk might seem out of place in a book about chromatic media, but put in dialogue with the introductory essays and other pieces in the volume, can we go to the next slide? As well as a selection of Du Bois's remarkable infographics, which he created with his students in Atlanta for the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1910, these thinkers still unfortunately, all too relevant musings on color as both racial metaphor and lived experience give readers fresh eyes through which to approach these pieces. However, despite the range of historical periods and disciplines represented here, these essays are by no means exhaustive. They almost all focus on the United States, although we have some that focus on Britain and one piece focusing on the Chinese context. But we really hope that today's discussion will be an opportunity to learn more from those of you who are based in the UK or elsewhere about other geopolitical frameworks of racialized color protocols. And we're just hoping that this volume will be a conversational catalyst for focused discussions of chromatic media and race in the years to come. And I guess with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to now see here. Whoops. Bye-bye. Okay. I have minimized everybody else, so I can't see anything except my screen. I guess I'll keep it that way. If there's any problems, please interrupt me because I'm kind of blind now. Okay, so I'm going to focus on an overview of the contents in part 2 and 3, picking up from where Lida left off. So part 2 is lighting for whiteness in moving image media. And we begin here by giving a broad overview of the fact that in the beginning of the 20th century, we find ourselves in a context of large-scale industrialization, emergence into new forms of mechanization, cinema, cars, clocks, trains, and telephones, and many people are left uncertain about the adoption of new behaviors and perceptual experiences. In the creative arts, these fears and anxieties are expressed on the canvas with wild brushstrokes or in eye-popping vivid colors, and on the silver screen by way of rapid pace editing and magical montage sequences. Across all modern industries, however, there is also a marked drive to codify color in a globally exchangeable, reproducible standard. So this obsession with standardization, which very soon during this time began to encroach into visual culture. So it might seem at first like in this situation, race would then become more apparent in a paradigm of optical media. But most histories of screen media actually do not often address the ways in which color-based media naturalizes these culturally constructed equations between skin color and race. As a result of this, dominant histories are falsely taken as apolitical and colorblind, i.e. raceless. Accordingly, the essays in part 2 address the ways in which the largely text and linguistic-based grammars of part 1 become hardened into the visual technologies of theater lighting, celluloid film, and analog photography. The authors that we have included in part 2, of which Aileen Robinson is here today, scrutinize the overwhelming conflation of skin color, i.e. surface, as the primary site of the production of meaning and justification for racism. The cultural assumption that surface bears an intrinsic relation to what lies underneath it dates back centuries, of course, and we can even cite evidence of this in Goethe's 1810 proclamation that, quote, color in its infinite variety exhibits itself on the surface of living beings, becoming an important part of the outward indications of what lies underneath, passes underneath, close quote. So this essentialist conflation of surface to content acquires new meaning in this age of optical media when surface color refers to both bodies and skin. Like, how do we separate or differentiate them? So the authors in part 2 deconstruct this fallacy while simultaneously critiquing how equating skin color with race often obscures other forms of less visible racial marginalization. Robinson's essay, Black Art, Light, Magic, and Racial Techniques of Innovation, locates the roots of lighting for whiteness in the costuming and lighting techniques of the 19th century theatrical performance and magic show. So, of course, we will hear more about this in a minute. So just giving you a flag as to where this essay is the first essay in part 2, but I will move on from it to the second essay, which is Richard Dyer's The Light of the World, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. British cultural critic Richard Dyer, and from his canonical text, White, Essays on Race and Culture. And so published initially in 1997, it was really one of the first works to critically interrogate how photography and cinema and light-based media both fix and naturalize an aesthetic of whiteness. So for Dyer, he kind of lays the groundwork or opens up some new roads of scholarship and critique within this genre of race-based media analysis, for screen media, and the inclusion of this idea of color as both race and as phenomena, sensory phenomena. Similarly, Lorna Roth's essay, Looking at Surely, the Ultimate Norm, Color Balance, Image Technologies, and Cognitive Equity, originally published in 2009, was also one of the early ones to address how light skin bias socially and technologically is embedded in color film stock, emulsions, and digital camera design. So she traces here the origins of this Shirley card and China girl, and argues that their deployment of white women's flesh tones as the keystone becomes the keystone for adjusting all other color in the image. So this quote that I've included, "This color girl is always white," kind of gets to the heart of her point here. Geneviève Yu's essay on the China girl on the margins of film. She excavates the origin as well of the China girl reference card and also brings in an archival approach that was seemingly unique and different from much feminist film criticism at the time. And she argues in her essay that the China Girl is a hybrid subject-object, one that brings together filmic materiality, race, and gender, and provides us with a new way of thinking through the afterlives of post-filmic digitization. Ali Fezer, also a very unique approach and take that we are happy to include in this volume, does an archival study of chromatic media and Kodachrome at the Kodak labs and archives. And in this essay, she considers the material substrate of these technologies to unearth racialized social and technical practices otherwise not written about in history or in scholarship to date. So this is what we would really consider a kind of path-breaking integration of photographic color technologies integrated with ethnographic studies and the history of eugenics and white supremacy in a specifically post-industrial America, post-war America. And her fieldwork mostly here takes place at the archival sites in Rochester, where George Eastman's longtime factory is located, and she also contours his links and associations with the American Eugenics Society. Lastly, the last essay in part 2 is Tina Post's Advantage Black, Hyper-Blackness in Performance and Self-Portraiture, where Tina moves beyond some of the mass media circuits into the gallery space to interrogate how some of the ways contemporary artists from the African diaspora renegotiate Blackness in their work as, again, both race and sensory hue. So in this very interesting argument, she explores the material and philosophical contours of Surrey Nanosystems Vanta Black, which you can see here, but you can't really see because the idea is that it's so black, it's the blackest black that has ever existed. And she creates these interesting links to the way in which this blackness of this black is rhetorically or discursively presented to people through these metaphors of the jungle or the wild. So taken together, the essays in part 2 analyze how color-based racial and gendered attributes have become embedded within this biased imaging systems, falsely presenting themselves as neutral. And we include this image here from cinematographer Ava Berkowski for HBO's Insecure to show that there are creative ways to properly light or find alternatives to lighting, which was in this case the cast's majority black cast, by including special cosmetics, a whiteboard with LED filters, and using light situations in non-standard, non-normal ways. So now I will move on to part 3, which is the third and last part of the volume, and it focuses on algorithms. So it's hardly news to us today, living in our contemporary climate, that algorithms intensify what is already pre-existing stereotypes by classifying people in ways that draw on much longer legacies of racist grammars and protocols, as contoured in parts 2 and 1. From Google Images' 2015 object recognition algorithm sorting Black people into a folder labeled gorillas, to Nikon camera's facial recognition system asking a Taiwanese American woman and her family members if someone blinked, despite everyone's eyes being fully open. These appalling but ultimately unsurprising technological errors shed a glaring light on only a few of the myriad ways in which algorithmic racial bias is never merely technical. A handful of engineers, scholars, activists, and artists collectively maintain that these racist algorithms are not set in stone. So, for example, the algorithmic biases that fail to detect darker skin tones could be reframed as providing an opportunity for the formation of counter strategies. Here we see one example, Adam Harvey's CV Dazzle, and Jillian Mayer's another example, How to Hide from Cameras. Oh, no, it's not there. They both use this concept of dazzle camouflage or reverse camouflage, which is a technique that was used during World War I in the case of what's called razzle-dazzle ships to obscure detection. And so they have appropriated this technique from the military and used it in these projects to comment on the ways in which algorithmic detection can be equally obscured from its pattern recognition system. Another similar example are from digital artists experimenting with strategies of AI and opacity. Two are Zach Blass that we see here, Informatic Opacity, and Ido Sterl. Following the work of poet Edward Glissant, Blass argues that everyone has a right to opacity, to be unknowable and undifferentiated as an ethical stance against imperial conquest and domination. And I can say that personally, this right to opacity is one that I have been especially eager to embrace in the last few years. So Blass calls this informatic opacity following the work of Phil Agra, who from the early 90s published an essay maintaining that capture, like informatic capture, is the dominant mode of surveillance today, which marks a break from the optical-based panoptic systems of part 2 into one where the locus of surveillance becomes more about computational logistics and data aggregation, and more readily bound to the numeric and linguistic than the visual. So that's ultimately the differentiating break between part 2 and part 3. The essays in part 3, algorithms, adopt this spirit of critique as they move from the visual to the computational. They address how informatic tools like search engines, digital filters, and facial recognition technologies exhibit racial bias for light, skin, and prior media, but now through algorithmic encoding. So in Zach's piece here, we see he's morphing the skin to, again, try and mess with the detection algorithms. The first essay in part 3 is an excerpt from the somewhat foundational, definitely foundational, not somewhat foundational, Lisa Nakamura's Cybertypes, Race, Ethnicity, and Identity on the Internet, originally published in 2002. And we wanted to include this here because it was so important in the way that it outlines this idea of identity tourism and how race can be seen or not seen or attempted to be hidden online. In response to, she's concerned with what was then the prevalent rhetoric that the internet is neutralized, right? It erases social and bodily difference. She was one of the first to point out that this is a misguided techno-utopic notion, and our race and our material identity are inseparable from internet technologies. The internet, she says, is a place where race happens. The next 3 essays in part 3 are offering critiques of facial recognition software, which we could see in some sense as a kind of apotheosis of century-long tendencies to privilege the prototypically white face as the norm across multiple media platforms. In this sense, the Shirley cards and China Girl of part 2 can be seen as the data, right, the data set or the raw material that is then used to train cameras and train algorithmic systems in part 3. The next essay that we have in this along these lines is Ruha Benjamin, an excerpt, Coded Exposure. Some of you might be familiar with her work, where she traces the multiple meanings of the word exposure, from the amount of light contained in a photograph to the condition of unwanted visibility, bridging, again, part 2's focus on the visual paradigm to part 3's focus on the algorithmic. Amber's Sweets, Essay Cyborg Cute, Colors of Good Mixed Race Algorithms. Lida and I were both thrilled to include this essay in the volume, and I will not say too much more about it because we will hear more on it shortly, except to just flag your attention to where it falls within the organization of the project. Jianting Chen's essay, Yellow Women's White Faces in Chinese Little Fresh Photographic Self-Portraiture, expands on what is really an American focus in this volume to examine digitally enhanced whiteness in 21st century beauty ideals in the East Asian context. So Jianting's contribution analyzes this use of fair and flawless selfies as ideal images for online circulation and the way they have led to a crisis of recognition, authenticity, and subjectivity among Chinese women. So she takes a slightly fresh approach and saying, instead of seeing the white face as being a reiteration of white supremacy, she looks at it as being possibly an alternative or a new form of articulation within the specific East Asian context. So it's a very interesting piece. Now, the penultimate essay in part 3 is from Karan Karim, The Algorithmic Images and Recursive Epidermalization. Here, he argues that regardless of the good or ill intent of the organizations behind the design of chromatic technologies, when it comes to algorithmic images created with generative AI, we encounter a fundamental propagation and reification of color-based racial stereotypes. So he puts together theorists in conversation like Walter Benjamin, Wilhelm Flusser, and Frantz Fanon to discuss this concept of, epidermalization, which he argues in algorithmic images have lost the vestiges of their predecessors, that is the traditional filmic images, moorings of physicality, i.e. Benjamin, while reproducing hegemonic ideologies in new, unprecedented ways. And we close part 3 with a final interview between Lisa Nakamura, now 20 years after Cybertypes, in discussion with Lida, who was at her time her very lucky postdoctoral student. And in this wide-ranging conversation, the two touch on topics from emoji color customization to Crayola's 1990s multicultural pack to tech companies outsourcing of micro work to women in the global South. Altogether, the essays in part 3 analyze how the encoding of racism within color media persists alongside new developments in informatics and algorithmic extraction. And I will just close my portion by saying that it was our hope throughout this volume and when we started the project that we could create a space and a series of conversations from different angles and different disciplines for scholars and practitioners alike, and allow a space to conscientiously develop a growing critique of color technological forms and situate them within broader histories and cultures of oppression. So that's my part for now. Vicky, should we go to Aileen? Aileen or Eileen?
Oh, Eileen, but I respond to both. So
Okay.
I'm happy to jump in. Should I jump in?
Yeah. Eileen, do you mind introducing yourself then? Maybe we can just have everyone.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's not.
Yeah, no problem. Hello, it's really
Okay.
great to be here
Thank you.
with everyone. And my name is Eileen Robinson. I'm an assistant professor at Stanford University in the Department of Theater and Performance Studies, and I hold affiliate positions also with Science Technology Society and African American Studies. And I'm very excited to present this work, which is also part of my larger work on kind of illusion works, technologies, and histories of science and performance. And I'm working on a book right now on Black magicians. So I'm happy to chat about that. And I just want to highlight one thing before I get going, which is just that, and just can I confirm everyone can see that? Okay, great, perfect, wonderful. Okay, one thing I want to highlight is that I'm working with magicians who are kind of crisscrossing the Atlantic often, right, in a transatlantic performance style. And so as we think about the ways that color and color conversations are moving, we can also talk about the various types of transatlantic audiences that are receiving these conversations, and be happy to talk more about that. All right, so let me just restart this and then so I can. Great. Okay. Okay, so in this essay, Black Art, Light, Magic, and the Racial Techniques of Innovation, I focus on one specific example of many that engage with questions of high contrast technology and the ways in which magic participated in their circus. By the 1880s, magic performance had its own audiences, its set of performances, its repertoires of tricks, its published volumes that were both loved and hated, that shared theatrical techniques of disguise, obfuscation, and disappearance. I'll come back to this in a little bit, but just to give you a sense, right? This was a color-coded world. Late Victorian stage magic celebrated a golden age, reflecting the modern ethos of an imperial modern world with a racialized color comedy, technological and scientific innovations, and a participation in colonial expansion. Magicians, predominantly white, could celebrate a rising scientific secularism while trading on a newly configured, quote unquote, irrationality of magic that was reserved for an imagined East. White European men styled themselves as Arab, Indian, Chinese, and Japanese. And we'll talk a little bit more about Max Ozinger here, who is styled as Ben Ali Bey in the kind of red poster to the left. As race hierarchies resulted in stereotyped colors, the language of black, red, yellow, and brown became refracted through magic's prism, resulting in costumes, makeup, and magic tricks that circulated colonial thoughts and behaviors. And we can see this specifically also in the theater through the legacies of costuming and makeup. I don't have time to talk about that today, but happy to talk further about that as we go forward. By the 1880s, some of the major tricks that came out really were predicated on high contrast illusions. The one I want to focus on today was called Black art. And this term was used throughout the 19th century to refer to a lot of different phenomenons that I will talk about that all come together. This Black art technique from the 1880s was a specific type of contrast performance that required a high amount of carefully timed theatrical choreography in which objects would suddenly appear and disappear, beautiful women be conjured, decapitated, and restored, and spirits could rise. And you see here a rendering of that from Hardine Burlingame's book, Herman the Magician. And here we get to the kind of classic images and tropes: the decapitated white woman, the skeleton, and also the kind of floating angel figure. And of course, with in this case, a kind of wizard-esque performer with the wand. The act worked through the simple reveal of a contrasting object against a black background, a white wand, a white ghostly hand, or a white woman. And lights were arranged around the side of the stage to further amplify the effects of the black and white contrast. Here's another example of the ways in which the lights were positioned towards the audience in order to allow for the depth of the black box, this black stage, to then allow for the heightened contrast between the kind of white performer and the white objects, and of course the black background. And of course to disguise the hidden labor of the figures working in the background. This became such a popular show that the question of its origins became a major query point for magicians around the turn of the century. And so Harry Houdini, in his Conjurer's Monthly magazine of December of 1907, published Austrian magician Ottokar Fischer's editorial, The Inventor of Black Art, Ben Ali Bey, known as Max Ozinger. And you see here the screenshots of this essay that gets published, and then also generates a flurry of essays and editorials about who really invented the piece. I want to highlight this because it's quite important to note that the way he tells the story, the narrative of the origins point of his understanding black art, was predicated on a particular type of racist alignment. He tells the story, Ozinger tells the story of developing illusion after working at the National Theater in Berlin as a stage manager and an actor. And during a scene in a dungeon, which is draped in black velvet, a part of a theatrical technique, right? A black slave who is most likely performing in blackface enters to save a captured maiden, Lucy. And Fischer recounts Ozinger's inability, because of an accident of lighting, right? Inability to see the black-faced actor, and claiming that only being able to see the whites of the teeth, and if ever a German had a brainstorm, that man was Ozinger. The idea of the aha moment of ingenuity aligns innovation with the imagined body already mediated through the histories of blackface minstrelsy, imperceptible and flattened, erasing distinction and accuracy, evoking in its wake a racist joke. And the story, which is repeated as testimony to this spark of innovation, enacts the very logic that developed through technological experimentation, performance practice, and cultural hierarchies. The black figure, which indexes the black body and person, becomes a generative source, a tool that corresponds with the racial cultural logic that ascribes blackness to the background. And I argue here for a technical racialized vision, a mode of perception that combines the technological, the artistic, and performative practices that Ozinger displays in his narration. And while scholars such as Jim Steinmeier, an illusionist and magician, attributes the story as a quote-unquote suspiciously neat tale of invention, I want to highlight the ways in which the technical racialized vision allows for a particular type of slippage between racist joke and neutrality. But in fact, these are not the case. This is a long-standing practice. Ozinger is reflecting a long-standing practice of seeing blackness in the background, and of the relationship between blackness, black magic, and the black person being rendered in negative ways, being assumed into this vocabulary and language. Magic performance was an essential medium for conveying and normalizing these racial hierarchies because of its alignments with its own color comedies. Capitalizing on the complex relationships between sight and perception, magic tricks created narratives that both privilege objects rendered white while also reifying negative associations for objects rendered black. The magic illusions in the development of modern media were not separate from perceptions on racial difference or imperial practices of hierarchy that made what we look at inextricable from how we see. And so these strategies of light and dark that we see predicated in the black art illusion concretize within the performance form the prior kind of practices of privileging both a fair tone actor, and which privileged whiteness as the condition of the object seen, witnessed, and acknowledged, and it made natural the racist rhetoric and assignation of Black skin to and with the background. Even though Black art was an optical trick, the perceptual alignments with racial color symbology was not an illusion at all, and these were recorded in magic and in language. And there's many elements to this history that I can talk at length about, but I want to highlight a few key aspects that correlate to how we think about Black art as a specific show, but then also how it worked in technique prior. And what is important to note is that in the decades leading up to the 1880s and the development of this illusion, Black art had already been Black magic had already been accorded a malevolent designation, but one that could be circumvented by a white performer. So Black magic as malevolent divination became directly aligned with European skin tone racisms, and this is much prior to the 1880s, and allowed colonizers the opportunities to use good-bad binaries for expansion, conversion, and resource extraction. The language of Black magic, and we can recognize these terms potentially: mumbo jumbo, the way in which voodoo is used, negromancy, enacted its own colonial deception and its totalizing stance. The quote from its time: the African creed is demonology, the specters of the dead, witchcraft, or Black magic. And so the color codes of magic itself, both inside and outside the performing arts, participated in concretizing these types of color binaries. Magic performances, both in their narratives and their illusions, benefited from walking the edge of fear and delight, sight and blindness, misperception and seeing. And the modern stage magician could trade on these in order to create suspense for their magic acts. The description of true magic to the imagined East and colonized Africa gave these magicians, who were predominantly white, affordances to perform at the margin of whiteness. The modern magician emerging after the 1830s, could thus, with relative security, align themselves with mysterious supernatural forces as a narrative fodder, while maintaining the focus on skill, technique, and stagecraft. Collapsing distinctions between geography, religion, and people, white magicians crafted stage performances that included beheadings, resurrections, ghosts, and seances. I want to note stage magic is quite violent in its imaginaries. It is about restoration as well as decapitation, but when we can talk more about the ways in which violence and color symbology go hand in hand repeatedly across these networks. I highlight here Robert Houdin, who I don't talk about in the essay, but I wanted to highlight him a little bit because he's as a central French magician who really kind of established a modern mode of magic. We can see in this image the kind of plethora of tricks that he offers, but also I just want to indicate in the background here this figure, which is the kind of the ornamental candle holder as in the figure of a Black woman. Right. And so the trading of the background, the Black object to the background, the Black figure to the background persists throughout in a variety of different ways. I want to just highlight, as I draw to a close, that the ways in which Black art moves across the century is not only in its rhetoric and then also its description between Black magic and white magic, but then also in the techniques, right, of the Black velvet, the kind of absorbing drapery, and of course the white effect. And this is the most readily seen in what many folks will remember or be familiar with, which is Pepper's Ghost, this eponymous magical illusion, stage illusion, theatrical illusion, right, which allows for a ghostly figure to be on stage, which again, within the storylines of these kind of of the Victorian era, also helps to support a kind of a vision of a white figure. And here I just want to highlight the three-headed lady, which in that illusion, the techniques for developing this is also about highlighting the whiteness of the figure and then the darkness of the background. Three girls were situated under the stage, closely positioned together. The woman in the middle wearing a light-colored silk dress. Two other girls on either side would be covered up to their necks with this fabric of a dead black color. The heads, hair, and arms of the body are covered with powder so as to present completely white surfaces. The dead black or non-reflective cloth absorbs the light to reflect it more fully, the image, so that the image is thus made on the spectator. So with this, and I just want to say, technological racialized vision developed through these performative strategies of stagecraft and contrast illusions. The alignment between skin, sight, and invisibility, rendered as artistic and scientific innovation in its special effects, surfaces again and again in Black art, bubbling up through long-standing associations between belief, religion, and skin tone. And here we have this image from 1912, which also teaches again the Black art illusion. But here we can see in the back what is rendered as the imp and the black bag, calling once again to the fore the language of race. And I just want to conclude on the image here. If we were asking questions about performance, I want us to end on this image of Milton Hudson Everett, one of the few Black magicians who develops his own solo show after performing alongside Adelaide and Alexander Herman as a magician. Here rendered again in the costume of Pierrot, thinking about these relationships between Black, white, and representation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. So we'll go to Amber.
Okay, can everyone hear me? We got it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Eileen. I'm really excited to be following this up. And I also wanted to, I think I'm like Carolyn in that when I share, let me share my screen. When I share my screen, I think it blocks everyone else out. So I cannot see anybody. So similarly to Carolyn, if anything arises or if anything kind of confusing or you can't see anything or I, clock out, let me know via the audio feature. But I did want to introduce myself. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Amber Sweat, and I'm an assistant professor of French and Francophone Studies at Amherst College, where I'm also affiliated with the departments of Black Studies and Film and Media. And I just got here, so we're in the first few months of the job. I recently finished my dissertation, which had to do with Black girlhood and screening in Francophone media, and I'm currently at work on my first monograph, which has to do with the aesthetics and coloration of glow in coming-of-age narratives, largely in the screen age for Black girls and Francophone productions as well. But the project that I'm presenting today, I'm really, really excited about because it's a bit outside of my field, but yet still connected in a lot of ways. Outside of my field insofar as it deals with a pretty American trend, but of course connected to my work through these questions of screens and race and aestheticizations of childhood. So my talk today is based on the chapter called Whose White Baby Is That? And I'll explain kind of that quote here in a second. Colors of Cyborgian Youth and Good Mixed Race Algorithms. And then just before I started, I did want to thank again the BAFS Color and Film Special Interest Group for inviting us all here. And thank you especially to Lida and Carolyn for their work in putting together the stunning edition, which I just got my copy of. A student asked to look at it the other day and I gave it to them, and it was so dense that it almost might have caused bodily harm. But it's a gorgeous, gorgeous, incredibly done book. So thank you again. So today's talk was born of my book chapter in the section entitled Algorithms. And even though it's kind of been in writing since about 2018, I like to kind of isolate it as a work in progress since 2013, when I myself began using social media. I myself am mixed race. I'm half Black and half Asian. And I noticed around my years in college, so maybe around 2014, that as algorithms became more intelligent, I started to get more and more posts in my landing pages that dealt with mixed raceness. This made sense to me given my own identity, but what was particularly weird was the obsession with mixed race children. So I'll give you an example right here. Instagram has kind of fluxed in and out of vogue, but that's really where it all started. And there are entire Instagram pages dedicated to, quote, cute mixed race babies. And it's a phenomenon I've been conscientiously tracking out of my own interests, but also in tandem with my research interests. This paper was also originally rooted in another writing project, very closely related, that has to do with the fetishization of mixed race coupling online in what is called the swirl community. So here are a few examples of that, which will come up later. In this chapter in particular, I wanted to talk about how the image of the mixed race child circulates through digital culture, particularly on the app known as TikTok, and how what I call as cyborgian cuteness exposes the persistence of whiteness and anti-blackness in algorithmic systems that often claim to be racially neutral, but as we have so far discussed, are never really neutral at their base. So in this talk, I hope to take us through the general structure of the chapter and then hopefully pivot into some thoughts that have percolated since the chapter's been in press. So the final steps and the final pieces of this chapter took place in 2022, 2023. So again, massive props to Lida and Carolyn for their work in this kind of longue durée. But it also means that a lot has changed as somebody who works on the internet, because there's kind of the fickle life of TikTok, whether or not it even gets to exist, to AI, to the production of AI images of children, and the focus on, communities such as motherhood, mom talk, etc. And another thing I wanted to mention, as I kind of was able to return to this project and ask these questions, is that a lot of these sources actually got deleted, which is also a very common problem in new media. So although this talk is more expository than it is maybe reparative, I do like to think that the reparation takes place in how difficult it has been to locate some of these sources. And I'll also mention that some of the people I will be talking about have since chosen to take their children off the internet. So out of respect to them, I do have some photos where the child's face is covered, or I've chosen not to include them at all. So I'll start this talk with a familiar scene that kind of catalyzed the project, move into the broader phenomenon of interracial culture online, and then trace how filters, algorithms, and parental expectations have weirdly kind of created this new digitally enhanced ideal of the mixed race child that is kind of reshaping both the internet and our material idea of flesh. All right, so we'll begin with a viral scene from Nick Cannon's 2014 film School Dance. In a prison visitation room, we see Cat Williams' character, who's named Darren, and he stares at his partner's light-skinned baby, and she says that these are both his children. And when he looks at the children, he asks, and pardon my language, whose goddamn white baby is that? He then goes into a very important and very viral diatribe where he gestures to his darker-skinned son and he says, and I quote, and not nearly as funnily as Cat Williams does it, "That one might be mine, that one right there. I'm not totally sure. Just because you name him Darren doesn't mean he belongs to Darren." And then he turns to the infant. "But I don't care what this baby's name is. That baby is rice-skinned, not light-skinned. That is a white child. That is Caucasian from the mountains of Caucasus. That is a Slavic baby, a Viking from Iceland. That baby has 730 as a credit rating right now as an infant." The moment is funny, absurd, and exaggerated, and it has lived a long second life online. The soundbite became a viral TikTok sound, which means that it was pulled away from the film scene and uploaded to TikTok, where people could use it kind of in the background of their videos, and people would mouth along to it. At the time I wrote this chapter, it was used in more than 22,000 uploads, mostly by Black fathers joking about their children's lighter skin or unexpectedly light features. Now, the trend is a subsection of a broader new media trend known as the swirl. I have a few examples here, which began back, I think, as far as 2013, as far back as I could find it. So across TikTok and Instagram, but really starting on YouTube, interracial families would gather under the hashtag swirl hashtag. These pages invited viewers into what looks like kind of a digital utopia. Everyday scenes of domestic harmony, packing lunches, dancing together, giving birth. The tone was always very wholesome and very feel-good, with the message being that love conquers race. Within these videos, the mixed race family becomes an emotional balm. Their faces are always soft and smiling and full of promise, and they are imagined as living proof that the world is moving beyond racism. Such assumptions receive critical pressure, however, in texts such as Nakamura and Chow White's 2012 Race After the Internet, which engages a forceful critique of the utopian discourse that characterized early digital media, in response to the assertion that the internet age has crafted new information societies that are radically equal. Today, the swirl phenomenon, a social media movement that champions post-raciality and assumed race neutrality via mixed-race couples' shared accounts of daily life, is a paragon example of the internet's assumed racelessness. While Black and white couples make up most of the hashtag's landscape, couples of various racial assortments call for partnership beyond racial division. depicting their quotidian as one where ratio-ethnic mixing is a pleasurable and comical part of the everyday. And I also wanted to add here, the comical part of a lot of these videos is actually Blackness as obstacle. So a really common theme you'll see is like, can my husband do my hair? Or can my husband eat my food? It's too spicy. That's a very common clickbait. So at the core of it is still a very particular type of racialization that configures Blackness as a problem. But of the various activities that sororal couples take part in, childbearing and child rearing draw the greatest influx of views, with videos vacillating between events as banal as lunch preparation and as intimate as live childbirth. The latter typically draws the highest views alongside pregnancy announcements, and they are on the internet, but I chose not to include them in this presentation. So the sororal couple reaches their most popular with the conception and birthing of a child, as well as the audience concerned to see what the child will look like. But when you scroll through these videos, patterns start to emerge, which you might notice in the videos I put here. Lighter skinned children, children with blue eyes or looser curls, consistently draw higher likes, comments, and shares. And that's where this talk begins, with a viral joke that reveals an algorithmic truth. TikTok doesn't just mirror our biases, it learns them, amplifies them, and rewards them based on its elusive algorithm. And we'll talk here in a bit about kind of the economic implications of this as well. So TikTok's algorithm is famously elusive. Officially, the platform has actually shared this following information, contending that the content on a user's For You page, which is kind of like the landing page, is based on the following: user interactions, videos that a user creates, likes, shares, or forwards, duration of engagement with certain videos or measured time spent viewing a certain video, completion of the video, or rewatches, is the first and the most pivotal one overall, but also within this thesis. Video information, so that'll be captions or metadata tags like hashtags or sounds, like the one that I'd mentioned, and 3 device settings, so the device's geographical location, language settings, or device type. TikTok maintains that this triad exists in equal tandem with one another and a number of unnamed factors, but my findings and some other citations in literature have emphasized that one of these practices kind of overshadows all of the others, and that is how long one lingers on a piece of content. TikTok's short-form videos facilitate engagement in an era of decreased attention spans and increased want for concise narratives, leading to more video exposure in a reduced amount of scroll time. TikTok's algorithm thrives on surprise and then suspension, the stare, or what I like to call the huh of it all. The platform learns what keeps us watching, what makes us linger, and one of its most reliable triggers is unexpectedness. In this case, a baby whose appearance seems to defy our expectations of who their parents are. That shock of unexpected whiteness, the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the light skin, acts as a digital hook. People pause, replay, and many people comment, and the algorithm notices. You might even have taken a moment to look at the numbers on these screen caps. They're massive. This one on the right, for instance, has 1.7 million likes, which is madness. TikTok tells us that our For You page is generated from 3 things. And what we tend to look at longest are images we find cute, rare, or anomalous. So a little aside here on cuteness. Cuteness itself is a form of capital in the attention economy, and it's not just about pleasure, it's also about profit. But cute things, puppies, babies, soft voices keep us scrolling and keep us engaging, and they keep us clicking. They literally rewire the brain's reward system and the algorithm by proxy. But on TikTok, cuteness also becomes racialized. When the mixed race child's features lean toward whiteness, that cuteness becomes more algorithmically valuable. Comment sections reinforce this. I don't know where the slide went. I was just scanning and it disappeared, but I had a slide that included some citations, largely including comments such as, she's got good hair, those good eyes, or such a good mix are very common comments. And I think it's a good time to talk about goodness. So if the popularity of mixed race children online depends upon their cuteness, that cuteness must be understood in close proximity to whiteness. The child of color, particularly one who appears monoracially Black, tends to be distanced from the dominant cultural imagination of the cute or innocent or good child, an image historically grounded in white ideal. And as a result, such children receive less algorithmic visibility and social attention. In these moments, goodness becomes shorthand for colorist beauty hierarchies that privilege whiteness and its phenotypic markers, lighter skin, looser curls, and blue or green eyes. But it's not just whiteness that itself captivates the gaze, as I would argue, it is also the unexpectedness of whiteness. The algorithm thrives on surprise, and the appearance of recessive, white marked features in a child of color provides precisely that, Western scientific discourse, with its binary classification of dominant and recessive genetic traits, sets the stage for this reaction. Traits coded as dominant, brown skin, brown eyes, dark hair, are associated with blackness, while recessive traits, blonde hair, blue eyes, are aligned with whiteness. The very language of dominance and recessiveness implies a hierarchy. One set of traits subsumes the other. So when a mixed-race child displays features that defy this hierarchy, when recessive whiteness seemingly reemerges, it's often read as a kind of genetic victory or miracle. Comments on accounts such as the Williamson family here on the left or the Llewellyn fam here on the right frequently describe such features as having defeated the dominant black traits, framing their return as some messianic restoration of whiteness. This apparition of white features becomes an object of fascination, thus propelling engagement and visibility. The effect of this unexpected whiteness, I might argue, that both entices and unsettles viewers, fuels prolonged gazing and consequently greater algorithmic reach. This phenomenon also extends beyond the screen. For instance, maybe not the most peer-reviewed, but a really interesting discussion came from a 2022 Reddit thread on mixed race entitled "Anyone Else Gets Stared At in Public," which drew numerous responses from mixed race users affirming that their ambiguous appearances often provoke attention, alongside the idea of being good-looking, especially if they're mixed with whiteness. And similarly, in the comment section of a video by the once famous swirl couple Jamie and Nikki, whose child's face I have obfuscated, one viewer remarked, "Can't stop staring at that unique and beautiful face. I have watched this video so many times." In these encounters, the inability to easily categorize a face by conventional racial markers render it anomalous. This anomaly invites the gaze. It asks to be studied, admired, or decoded. Thus, the lighter feature mixed-race child becomes doubly intriguing. First, as a break from monoracial expectations, and second, as an instance in which mixedness unexpectedly yields whiteness. The algorithm thus amplifies this intrigue, converting the disruption of racial legibility into sustained attention. In other words, the good mixed-race child is not just aesthetically desirable, they're algorithmically optimized nowadays. And this is very important, if your child is optimized enough to go viral, you make a lot of money. In fact, these two families that I had just mentioned have made their entire livelihood recording their children and recording their day-to-day life. And this brings us back to the idea of the child being born for the internet, and in this case, being born with the hopes that they have the mixed race look that warrants virality and, by proxy, economic advantage. So if the algorithm, rewards whiteness, users learn to produce it. If you scroll through the hashtags like mixed baby or swirl, you'll see filters labeled glow, bright side, dreamy girl, or big-eyed baby. These filters enlarge eyes, lighten skin, add digital sparkles, pushing the child's image beyond natural human proportions. I call this a cyborgian cuteness, an aesthetic where the mixed-race child becomes part human, part machine. And they also look uncanny. This child on the right actually is a child of Latina descent whose mother made this image. The cyborg here isn't just science fiction, it's a social condition. The child's image is hybrid, an organic body merged with digital augmentation. Parents often use these filters to make their children appear more marketable, more beautiful, more clickable. The whitened, filtered image attracts followers and, in some cases, brand sponsorships. Cuteness, again, becomes algorithmic currency that converts racialized aesthetic into economic gain. But these images also carry something uncanny. Pardon me. The filters designed for adult faces distort the child's proportions. Eyes too large, noses too small. The result is both alluring and unsettling. And in the pursuit of cuteness, the line between human and digital begins to blur even in real-life expectations of the child. Because this digital whitening doesn't just stop at the screen. It seeps into desire, into what parents hope their child will look like. In 2022, for instance, a TikToker posted an ultrasound video with the caption, "Got pregnant and thought I'd have an exotic mixed baby." And this is, I couldn't find the original video, but somebody had screen capped it to criticize it. Only to reveal a perfectly ordinary looking toddler in the next frame. And the top comment on this video said, "Mixed with delusion," with these two emojis. And another comment said, "The fact that she said exotic says it all." So people are actually becoming quite aware of this. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. So while it's kind of funny to read these comments, it's also quite heartbreaking. The joke exposes a growing expectation that mixed-race children should look a certain way, ambiguous, light, but aesthetically perfect, enough so that you can monetize the child through their image on the internet. And Jamie and Nikki, who I'm going to return to, one of YouTube's original interracial influencer couples, showed how deep this went in one of their original videos. Now deleted, there is a video when their first daughter was born, and Jamie looked into her newborn eyes and said, "Look, she has blue eyes." His mother gently corrected him, "No, honey, all babies are born that way," and in the original video you can see Jamie's face fall. What's striking is the hope behind his insistence, that his child might embody the algorithmically successful version of mixed-race beauty that had preceded them. They were already very, by the way, in this scene and monetizing their daily life. When her eyes later turned brown, their videos draw fewer views and fewer comments regarding how beautiful she was. Also, recently, in one of the last instances that Jamie had uploaded his daughters, none of the videos had gone particularly viral except for one video where his daughter was holding a white doll. So the algorithm quite literally preferred the plastic white uncanny child to the real one. These patterns reveal something profound about how digital culture reshapes the human and our crises of recognition for children and parents. Generation Alpha, for instance, children born after 2010, are the first to grow up inside filter culture. They don't really remember a world before AR. For them, self-image begins in a camera app. French sociologist Anne-Marie Lemel once described the cyborg child as one whose life is mediated through constant digital interaction. Today, that description feels almost literal. For mixed-race children especially, this mediation carries racial weight. They're asked to embody both a technological fantasy and a racial one, to be the future, the proof of post-racial harmony, the algorithm's ideal. But this ideal is not neutral. It is a whitened, filtered fantasy that shapes how children and their parents understand beauty, value, belonging, and economy. The aesthetics of the online world are leaking into the offline one, the URL becoming IRL. So what do we make of all of this? In theory, the mixed-race child should represent a future beyond racial binary, a hopeful vision of hybridity. But online, that hybridity flattened into a single aesthetic: light skin, loose curl, bright eyes, symmetrical features. This is the good mixed-race algorithm at work, rewarding proximity to whiteness and punishing deviation from it quite materially. Anti-Blackness hasn't vanished from the digital age. It's simply been translated into the language of pixel, filter, and engagement metric. What we're seeing is the rise of the algorithm's child, a child whose image is shaped by code, curated for maximum cuteness, and filtered toward a digitally perfected whiteness. And so when Cat Williams shouts, "Whose white baby is that?" the most honest answer in 2025, at least when it comes to TikTok, might be, it's the algorithm's baby. A child raised by the attention economy, edited by augmented reality, and loved in proportion to their digital glow and the money their image makes. So as we scroll through the internet, the faces that hold our gaze, those impossibly cute, impossibly bright, impossibly white faces, remind us that the post-racial phantasm of the internet is just that, a phantasm. If one wants to contend that the algorithm doesn't see race, we must also recognize that it does indeed feel it. It learns from our gazes, our biases, and our histories, and in doing so reproduces them, pixel by pixel, filter by filter, child by child. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of our speakers today. Thank you for such amazing, important papers and analysis of the different implications of the encoding of systems and protocols around color and chromatic media, as well as the implications of them in terms of lived experience and how that translates into contemporary media. I'd like to invite all of our attendees to ask questions. If you'd either raise your hand or if you could type them into the chat, that would be fantastic. Just pause briefly in case anybody is, I know there's so much to think about. One question I could ask, if that's okay, I just, as I've been reading through the book, thinking about the sections on the kind of question between skin as surface and the question around color and lived experience, the conflation of those kind of dimensions, particularly with your paper, Amber. Then I was just thinking about the kind of the history of photography and then the implications as we go back, and there are both colored and black and white photographs, and some of the algorithms with colorization as that implements either gestures, facial expressions, or colours as expressions of blushing or injury. Or there are apps now that kind of the gestures they implement are being receive kind of criticism from the users because they only opt for smiles or they only opt for particular types of expression. Have you noticed any particular manifestations of the types of uses of colour or expression in the material that you've been looking at?
Absolutely. That's a really, really good question. Actually, when I think about children in particular, something that people, I don't know why they're doing this. I think part of it's just humorous effect, and part of it is a little bit more weird and uncanny. But something that I'm seeing a lot also are parents who are using a filter to force their children to smile, just like you're saying. But not just smile, but smile with the entire, like the whole 32, as we might say, of adult teeth. And it's so strange because the way that people will talk about these children, so like I said, half of it's for comic effect, typically infants, toddlers, that they just look silly. But when you kind of enter that elementary, primary school age and you're seeing parents do this, a lot of people start to make comments about how, oh, they're going to be very good looking when they grow up. So there's actually something that becomes aging about using that filter, where you can kind of imagine what the child will look like with the adult set of teeth, strangely enough. And that really speaks to, I think, something that I've seen quite a lot in mixed race communities, which is no one knows what your kid will look like. And people really are desperate to know, like, oh, will my child be cute? Will my child, what does that even look like to have a mixed race child? And so one of the ways I have seen this, your comment is so apt, is by this tooth smile filter that's been coming up quite a lot. And another thing that I think is really interesting based on what you're saying is the filter that forces blushing. And I find this to be very, very common in, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, my mom's side of the family is from East and Southeast Asia, and I tend to notice it in those apps more than other apps. But what I really think is interesting in the ways that people put this, especially on their children, is it assumes a type of embodied experience, because that's what blushing does, right? It kind of puts forth that you are in love or you're nervous. And so there's kind of this way of actually thinking about even Carolyn's comment on opacity, making not opaque the way your child feels, and kind of exposing a child's emotion that is not one by way of the filter. And kind of the way I'm thinking about that as well is I'll see these filters used sometimes on children. Let's take, for instance, one of the families I mentioned in my slides. You'll see it with like, oh, little Johnny is so happy that we have 1 million followers, and they'll put like a blush filter. And so it kind of expresses a type of excitement or happiness that, you know, Johnny's 2 years old. He probably has no idea what's going on. And so at least, yes, it is very, very common. And at the level of children, it's a kind of new way of expressing something that a child has never expressed by way of maybe what the parents find will be funny, or what they will hope the child to look like, or what they hope will express some type of other engagement with an audience that the child is not aware of. So yeah, that's a great question.
That's really interesting. I was thinking vulnerability as well as you were speaking, that kind of positions some of them children perhaps more vulnerable in their appearance. I can see that we have a question from Kirsten and then Louisa as well. So Kirsten.
Yeah, thanks. Really great talks and such a fascinating volume. And I was starting to think, Amber, in relation to the discourse that surrounded Archie, you know, Harry and Meghan's baby, which obviously, so even though that's a celebrity baby and obviously might have very different factors at play. But my question is actually for Eileen. I was fascinated with this whole violence in the black magic and the depiction of the white body as unnatural or impossible through decapitation and these floating heads and so on. But also the black body as both invisible and unnatural too, at least in terms of the statue example that you pointed to, I think, in Pepper's Ghost. Do you see that there is any kind of flipping that happens here with this, with both the black bodies and the white bodies moving between? I was thinking of a cinematic example of rack focus, where you shift focal planes, and so I wonder if in this perceptual game of invisibility, largely for the black background, the black standing figure, are there moments of rack focus or switching of the binarisms that you have interestingly outlined?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, that's actually, it's very interesting because I want to, so no, not in these performances. So that's also, so not in these. So when black art becomes really fixed in this one particular form, right, as a name for a performance, the black art performance, there is no flipping. And in fact, you see some of the features in that final image. It's very kind of Hollywood, right? There's a Hollywood glamour version of the woman in the cutout, right? So there's also that being played on, right? So you don't see that. However, what you're that idea is absolutely within particular types of theatrical performance earlier on, and then also actually you see this in the Topsy Turvy doll. Right. Has anyone seen the Topsy Turvy dolls? A couple. Yeah. So there was a Topsy Turvy doll which was crafted, and it was a children's toy, and it was made to be on one hand, and it was actually Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? It was the original kind of one of the original kind of inspirations. And so on one hand you have the white Eva, and when you flip the skirt, right, you have Topsy, and that's Topsy Turvy, right? These dolls became manufactured as like Big Bad Wolf and Red Riding Hood as well. Like that there was a very small window where that was also marketed. I want to highlight that's different than what you're talking about in terms of the visual, right? But the paradigm was very much there to do this, but it wasn't actually done within the magic show itself. And part of this is also black magicians were often served as assistants, right? That would then disappear into the background as well. I want to highlight too about just really about the violence against women in magic. The violence against black people in magic and the violence against women in magic is rampant. It's rampant. And white female magicians also decapitate themselves and then put themselves back together, right? So there's a conversation to be had about that violence, and also who gets restored and like what that does, but the complexities of that. There's much more to talk about. Thanks for your question.
Louisa, would you?
Hi. Thank you so much for that. That was super interesting. I'm kind of a fashion studies person, so it's great to kind of hear from a completely different field, although there's lots of overlap. And yeah, there's a lot that I've kind of written down that I need to go and explore now. I was curious. My question is kind of for Amber, but I mean, anyone kind of pitch in if they've got any thoughts about this. What I've noticed on kind of TikTok and Instagram that's been happening and is being pushed is this kind of AI see what your baby might look like, sort of almost gamified exercise. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that in relation to kind of what you were looking at and potentially what that means, that this is kind of becoming really popularized as a way of engaging.
This is a really, really good question as well. And it speaks to a question I just saw in the chat from Kinjiro on mixed race children and their parents not being mixed. Do they go to the digital to seek help? These two kind of phenomena are very deeply intertwined in my mind, because way back when I was first starting to notice this trend, a comment you would see from time to time was someone coming in and being like, oh my gosh, I'm, Guatemalan and my husband's Nigerian and I never see this mix. And oh, it's so exciting to see, like, I hope our baby looks like yours, right? And so to answer that question, Kinjiro, that is something that was noticed was kind of on a representation or level of representation, people tended to enjoy that. And then with the question of AI, that's such a good one. And it's one that I've been thinking about since revisiting this project for this talk. I think what's interesting is when I look back at some of the images that were in the PowerPoint of the kind of uncannily strange looking children, you know, there's kind of that sense of the uncanny where you realize like, oh, this is a filter. Like somebody filtered their child, somebody took their child and laid an augmented reality filter on top of them. And how strange is that? Why would you do that? But kind of the procedure was, you became aware of the procedure. And there was a kind of a consciousness of the AR that was growing, especially for the comments that said like, this is weird. I think it was, no, Khloe Kardashian used to do this a lot, and she drew a lot of comments in magazines and tabloids. With AI, what's starting to happen that I think is really interesting is there is no knowledge that the child is even real. And you don't necessarily have the child as template to where there can be an overlay. And we actually don't know what parts of kind of the genetic code are being put into the production of this image. So with the AI, what will my baby look like kind of technologies, it's strange. I mean, I wish I had a better answer. But it's a face that doesn't exist. And I remember there are even some experiments back when AI was really picking up steam about a year and a half ago, where I think there's a website called like facethatdoesn'texist.com, where you could just, they would show you an auto-generated image of adults and children and would say, this actually isn't a person. Isn't that crazy? And so there's something that is at once interesting because it stays really close to the parents' features because the parents are inputting them into the system, but at once is also incredibly distanced due to the fact that there is no real child behind the image. So, but it also is a tradition that kind of follows those really awful in the early 2000s, maybe 2010s, kind of like face smash technologies that we used to see, where you would like see people's the two people's photos like chopped up and rearranged. And bric-a-brac into this kind of, you know, hypothetical child. So I think that that's something strange that AI is doing in these new types of simulation. And I'm also, yeah, Lisa, there you go, simulated. It is odd. And it's, I thankfully don't have, I would say like I would ask a friend who's done it to show me their child and see what comes of it. But I don't think anyone around me is doing that. But it is very odd, and it is something to keep in mind as we kind of think about the way we idealize children and their image.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Could I
Thank
quickly
you.
add on to that, actually? Just because it struck me, Amber, during your talk that, like, I think we're always asking, you know, is this technology that claims to be revolutionary and new, like how much about it actually is new? And I was thinking about that part 3 starts off with Lisa Nakamura, right? And Lisa Nakamura wrote about, in that initial book, Cybertypes, when she was writing about this isn't in the excerpt that we reproduced, but when she's writing about the Matrix, she says, you know, it's no coincidence that it was Keanu Reeves who was cast as a kind of racially ambiguous, multiracial person. And this idea of the kind of 1990s techno-utopian rhetoric around we will all be mixed race in the future. There are ways about it that are different, ways about it that are similar. And like Amber, I'm also mixed race, and growing up there during that time, I had a lot of people say like, we're all going to look like you, or, you know, you represent some kind of future. But I was thinking one of the technologies that was sort of like, it would have been kind of the equivalent of what we're talking about with the filters was the digital face morph. So, I mean, this is very much US context, but like I was just looking back on the 1993 cover of Time magazine called The New Face of America, how immigrants are shaping the world's first multicultural society. And then there's this face and it says, take a good look at this woman. She was created by a computer from a mix of several races. What you see is a remarkable preview of the new face of America. And Jennifer Gonzalez has written about this, the digital face morph, including in like Michael Jackson's music video for Black or White. So it's similar in a way in that, right, this isn't a person that actually exists. But yeah, so just wanted to kind of draw that historical connection. Yeah,
thank you, Lida. I also I think we might be talking about the same cover. I don't know why I dated it to 2006. It was way after that, but maybe it's just been so in my memory. But yes, Carolyn, I like your comment in the chat as well. Yes, she does.
Yeah, that one.
If anyone else has a question, or I just have one more, Carolyn, if that's okay. I know we spoke, well, Lida spoke early in the session about the China Girl, the Shirley card sort of image on the cover as a glitch of that kind of use of a color card at the start of film. And in some of the chapters, then the idea of the image, those images appearing only if there's a glitch in the screening of the film occurred. I just wondered if, Carolyn, as you've written on the glitch and it's kind of the disruptive force, whether potentially disruption or a glitch might have both a function, if you've thought about that in terms of color protocols specifically for this book, about its potential as a disruptive or critical force, as well as the way that it might reveal those protocols and those systems of representation through archival research or by accident. Have you kind of, are there instances in which it's contingency, chance, glitches are used as a critical practice?
Yeah, thank you, Liz, for that question. I haven't thought about a glitch in the archive, but in terms of the visual image, yes, I think one of the strategies that some of the artists that are outlined in the book take is this use of glitching, showing an error. It's meant to signify an error and to have it working on a double meaning, like an error in the technology, but also an error in how we're reading it or interpreting, you know, what we see, the skin color, the calibration, like something's off and something's wrong in the norm. But, you know, at the same time, when I do write about glitch in that book, I clarify that it's only certain uses that do that, or to try to use it to open up a conversation, because certainly we can go like, you know, commercials or advertisements completely use this glitch and static to have a kind of elicit a certain kind of experience, like this nonstop attention grabbing, loud kind of, that is not meant at all to open up a conversation or questions about, you know, race and representation or perception and color. So do you think it is? And also just actually to just tie this back into Miriam's question that she put in the chat about how we might approach this with our students, with, you know, this idea that there's a correct way, or like the filters will say, this is, let's correct your image here, like that. You know, I've taught a color course of one form or another at various different institutions, and I find that the students are quite readily acknowledging the idea that, you know, society suggests there's a certain way we should look and we should be. So that's not necessarily news to them, and they're more than happy to show this in their work. I think maybe the question that was like that they still, it doesn't mean that they're going to change their lives or their patterns. Like they still try to emulate the standard and whatever. They recognize it's the ideal, but that doesn't mean they're going to stop trying to adhere to it. And so, yes, sometimes they, you know, because they read some of the work on glitch and they say, okay, this is a technique for critiquing, so they might use it in that way. And, you know, there's other strategies aside from the glitch, like this idea of opacity and things like this. So.
If I could just quickly add to speak to the question about the students, I really, really hope that this volume is something that can be taught with, because I think coming out of trying to teach about color, technology, power structures in this particular way, I find that, as Carolyn said, students, at least in a kind of, you know, I can only speak to the sort of North American liberal arts context, but people are pretty willing to acknowledge at least at the institutions I've taught at, that white supremacy is real. There is a single sort of standard normative way. I think where I've tried to push the students is to move beyond just kind of the rhetoric of representation. We need more people of color and, you know, on this show or something like that, which is why I think the object, sorry, there's a siren outside.
Yeah.
Why the Shirley.
You're okay.
Yeah, no, it's fine. There's good.
Okay.
But yeah, that just why the Shirley card is such a useful way of showing, you know, we don't even see these artifacts. So they show that it's not just about representation. It's about a kind of infrastructural logic of whiteness or racialization. So I think the biggest challenge for me has been to get students to move beyond just a kind of discourse of representation and then the solution is just diversity. And I sort of push them to like, well, what do you mean by diversity? Is it diversity in the way that Crayola's multicultural crayons are diverse, which is just like taking 8 colors that already existed and repackaging them under the rubric of multiculturalism, right?
I would also like to add to this that whereas we know that the students understand it, whereas we know that the students are constantly adding on to this conversation around the bias, what happens is that when we look at the consumption patterns, or when we look at what they are creating in the end, many a times they still like to conform to these so-called rules that have been put up. And what happens is, while there's a lot of where they collectively speak about diversity and inclusivity, they also try to show that in their work. But the consumption patterns, like Amber also showed, do not show the same on the social media platforms.
Thank you. You have the opportunity to respond, or if you choose. Otherwise, I do realise we've run slightly over time, so we could also thank our speakers and draw to a close. Your choice. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm sure the conversation will continue. It's such an important volume for teaching and for research, which I know
Thank you so
I will
much.
be making my way through it again. So
Thank you
so much.
This.
Yeah, thank you for providing this platform. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been fantastic to hear you all speaking, to have the opportunity to meet. So thank you so much for coming along. To Lida Zeitlin-Wu, Carolyn Kane, Amber Sweat, and to Eileen Robinson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.